A single US dollar bill now commands 1.44 million Iranian rials on the open markets of Tehran. That 7-digit figure represents the precise mathematical weight of a collapsing state economy. Yet the survival of the regime that prints it ultimately hinged on a completely different calculation over a single 3-day weekend. In late May 2026, the world's most sophisticated intelligence apparatus stopped tracking troop deployments and began analyzing the digital signature of a leaked text document. This was the moment the mathematics of authoritarian survival shifted irreversibly. It did not require a fallen capital or a decapitated command structure. It required exactly 72 hours for every foundational assumption of a 47-year-old theological military system to dissolve simultaneously for nearly 5 decades. The Islamic Republic constructed its entire domestic legitimacy on a singular geometric premise: permanent defiance of American power. The regime engineered a dual-track security architecture designed to withstand external pressure while projecting regional force. On the first track, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps weaponized geography, maintaining the capacity to choke the Strait of Hormuz, a maritime conduit through which 20% of global petroleum transits daily. On the second track, gas centrifuges spun continuously inside hardened underground facilities carved deep into mountain ranges, gradually accumulating highly enriched uranium. This dual mechanism functioned as a shield of asymmetric deterrence, allowing the regime to export instability while insulating its leadership from direct consequences. By May 2026, that structural shield reached its point of physical fatigue. 2 months of an unyielding naval blockade under Operation Epic Fury compressed the Iranian economy into an inescapable vice. Annual food inflation surged to 72%, forcing basic dairy prices up by a fifth in mere weeks. On December 28, 2025, spontaneous civil unrest ignited across the territory, expanding systematically into 675 distinct protest locations across all 31 provinces. The physical architecture of the state remained intact, but its economic engine was rapidly seizing. The regime was running out of currency reserves, running out of domestic patience, and running out of time. The systemic pressure reached its absolute peak during the Memorial Day weekend of 2026. Inside Washington, subtle domestic indicators signaled an immediate transition to operational execution. The United States President abruptly cancelled attendance at a private family wedding, choosing instead to remain inside the West Wing. Hours later, the Pentagon cancelled all military leaves across critical command structures. Strike packages targeting Iranian command and control hubs sat finalized on the Resolute desk, awaiting only an executive signature. The intelligence community prepared for a massive, unconstrained kinetic campaign. The definitive justification for this imminent strike arrived via a federal law enforcement intercept. An Iraqi national, operating as a trained asset within the IRGC's extended network, was arrested after compiling an operational blueprint of a private estate in Florida. The operative had made a specific, documented pledge to assassinate Ivanka Trump, stating explicitly that the action was designed to burn down the House of Trump in retaliation for past command disruptions suffered by the regime. This was not rhetorical bluster broadcast on state media. It was an active operational plot against the president's immediate family. The intelligence provided the White House with total domestic political momentum and an unassailable justification for war. Then, the expected sequence broke. Instead of the sound of cruise missiles, 3 Iranian officials leaked a memorandum of understanding directly to the international press. The act of leaking from within Tehran, rather than waiting for an American announcement, revealed a desperate effort to manage an unmanageable narrative before the domestic population. The document proposed an immediate cessation of all regional hostilities, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and the complete elimination of transit fees for commercial shipping. In exchange, Tehran demanded the immediate release of $25 billion in frozen assets and the lifting of the naval blockade. State-run media in Tehran immediately launched a synchronized celebration, framing the framework as a historic triumph where Roman imperial ambitions bowed to Persian diplomatic strategy. But this triumphant narrative was systematically dismantled within hours. An anonymous White House official disclosed the missing clause of the agreement to the New York Times. The framework included a written commitment by Iran to surrender its entire stockpile of highly enriched uranium. The central symbolic pillar of the regime's 47-year resistance narrative was being liquidated in the quiet fine print of a desperate ceasefire. The regime had reached the terminal velocity of its own logic. To save its financial structure from immediate collapse, it had agreed to surrender its ultimate geopolitical asset, gambling that its domestic population would not read the American readout. A previous attempt to negotiate away the uranium program, just 1 month prior, had triggered immediate street protests from core regime loyalists who viewed the stockpile as the irreversible proof of their decades of sacrifice. By attempting to hide the surrender of the uranium inside a framework of false victory, the leadership signaled that it feared its own ideological base as much as it feared American bombers. This internal desperation was compounded by a profound constitutional void at the very apex of the state. Any binding international commitment requires the explicit ratification of the supreme leader. Yet Mojtaba Khamenei had not appeared in public since his designation on March 8, 2026. He remained confined to a medical facility in Qom, his official communications reduced to AI-generated videos that the Iranian public openly mocked on digital networks. The system was attempting to execute the most significant geopolitical capitulation in its history, while its sovereign authority existed only as an empty entity. A digital ghost incapable of enforcing compliance, the structural failure spread rapidly into the legislative branch. Inside the parliament, IRGC hardliners openly traded physical threats with civilian officials, warning that signing any ceasefire would simply invite deeper strikes by demonstrating weakness. The regime had fractured into two irreconcilable factions operating in direct contradiction. One faction leaking peace terms to secure $25 billion, while another faction actively ran assassination plots against American civilians. The mechanism of absolute power had started to strip its own gears. The system had begun to break down under the weight of its own survival metrics, leaving the ultimate consequences of this internal collapse hidden just beyond the immediate horizon. The immediate consequence of the leaked memorandum was not a stabilization of the markets, but a violent internal run on the state's liquid capital. Within 4 hours of the New York Times disclosure, the Central Bank of Iran observed a systemic anomaly. Domestic depositors were attempting to convert electronic rial balances into physical assets at a velocity that exceeded the processing capacity of the national banking server infrastructure. The regime's announcement of the $25 billion asset release failed to calm the panic because the market recognized the structural delay. The funds were locked behind a 60-day verification window, controlled by the United States Treasury. The population was unwilling to wait 60 minutes to stem the flight of capital. The governor of the central bank enacted an emergency cash rationing decree, restricting individual withdrawals to 50 million rials per day. At the parallel market rate of 1.44 million rials to the dollar, this measure legally limited every citizen to withdrawing $34.72 of value per 24-hour cycle. This intervention immediately paralyzed the internal commodity distribution network. The Grand Bazaar of Tehran, which accounts for 1/3 of the nation's wholesale trade volume, went dark within 12 hours as merchants refused to accept debit cards linked to frozen electronic ledgers. Transaction reverted to an ad hoc barter system using gold coins and foreign banknotes. This economic paralysis triggered an immediate industrial collapse across the nation's energy sector. As ambient temperatures across Khuzestan province climbed to 44 degrees Celsius on May 29th, the national electrical grid experienced severe thermal overloading. The 2-month naval blockade had prevented the importation of specialized synthetic lubricants required for the cooling towers of the Siemens manufactured gas turbines at the Damavand power plant. The Ministry of Energy was forced to make a catastrophic binary decision: maintain electrical baseload to the spinning gas centrifuges at the Natanz nuclear facility, or sustain the municipal water pumping stations serving the 15 million residents of the Tehran metropolitan area. They chose the centrifuges. The resulting voltage drops across urban substations caused an immediate cessation of water pressure in the capital's municipal distribution pipelines. By midnight, Dry conduits caused a reversal of pressure gradients within the subterranean sewage networks, causing toxic methane accumulation beneath the asphalt of southern Tehran. Explosions occurred in 3 residential districts, breaching underground gas lines and igniting localized structural fires that municipal services, lacking electrical power for hydrants, could not contain. The technical degradation of the infrastructure had converted an administrative decision into an immediate environmental hazard. This physical deprivation shifted the operational profile of the domestic unrest. The 675 protest locations across the country, which had previously operated on decentralized political timelines, merged into single, highly aggressive, resource-driven crowds. The distinction between ideological dissidents and ordinary consumers disappeared when the taps ran dry. In Isfahan, thousands of citizens occupied the dry riverbed of the Zayandeh Rud, using the concrete infrastructure as an assembly point to launch coordinated assaults against provincial administrative buildings. The state's internal security blueprint, which relied on isolating political factions from the broader populace, was rendered obsolete by a universal infrastructure failure. The kinetic load on the internal security apparatus exceeded its structural design limits. The law enforcement forces of the Islamic Republic, known as Faraja, rely on a base of 400,000 personnel, predominantly low-wage conscripts. By May 2026, a conscript's monthly stipend of 120 million rials possessed an actual purchasing power of $83 American, a sum insufficient to purchase 3 kilograms of imported meat for their households. When tactical commanders issued the operational mandate for the use of lethal force to clear water distribution points in Karaj, the chain of command fractured along economic lines. Conscripts recognized their own family members. In the bread lines they were ordered to disperse. The desertion rate within Farah AJ units reached 14% within a single 24-hour tactical cycle. To stabilize the perimeter of the capital, the IRGC General Staff deployed the elite Sabarin Special Forces Brigade from its forward deployments along the northwestern border. This movement of specialized tactical assets created an immediate security vacuum in the peripheral provinces. Kurdish insurgent factions inside West Azerbaijan province and Baloch nationalist groups in Sistan and Baluchistan identified the troop withdrawals within minutes through commercial satellite telemetry. Coordinated ambushes against isolated IRGC logistics columns began along the Pakistani border, resulting in the loss of 3 regional weapons depots and 48 heavy tactical vehicles. The regime attempted a final, desperate automated fix to regain control of the economic engine. At dawn on May 30, the central bank attempted an unannounced digital redenomination, deploying an emergency software patch to truncate 4 zeros from all electronic balances in a bid to psychologically suppress hyperinflationary indexing. The software, an unpatched proprietary platform running on obsolete servers insulated from international technical support, suffered a fatal database corruption during the automated ledger conversion. The National Payment Clearing Network, known as SHITAB, crashed completely. Every debit card in the Islamic Republic became a useless piece of plastic. The monetary system lost the physical capacity to communicate with the physical supply chain. At the port of Bandar Abbas, 300 commercial trucks carrying state-subsidized grain refused to ignite their engines because the corrupted digital network could not validate their state fuel allocations. 6,000 metric tons of imported wheat sat idling on heat-softened asphalt in 40-degree weather, while the bread lines in Mashhad grew to 3 blocks long. The regime had systematically destroyed its own mechanisms of control in an effort to preserve them. The system had passed its structural threshold. The machinery of the state was running, but the gears were no longer connected to the wheels. The physical reality of the post-surrender landscape is defined by a precise metric: 142.1 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium hexafluoride gas sitting inside the subterranean cascades of Fordau. This chemical stockpile, which took 4 years and $3 billion of diverted state revenue to accumulate, is now a liability without an owner. Under the terms of the Memorandum of Understanding, this material must be transferred to international custody within 30 days. Yet, as of May 31, 2026, the transport mechanisms are entirely paralyzed. The specialized armored transport vehicles required to move the volatile cylinders safely cannot secure an operational escort because the regional IRGC command structures refuse to recognize orders dispatched from a vacant office in Tehran. The geopolitical consequence of this command breakdown is an immediate, uncoordinated decoupling of the regional proxy network. For 3 decades, the asymmetric architecture of the Levant relied on a continuous injection of physical cash from Tehran, averaging $700 million annually to Hezbollah alone. The collapse of the Shetab digital network terminated these financial transfers within minutes. In southern Lebanon and western Syria, proxy units suddenly found their local payrolls completely unbacked. Deprived of logistical subsidies, field commanders have begun seizing local commercial infrastructure, transitioning from strategic state assets into localized protection rackets. The ideological front has dissolved into a distributed survival struggle. This strategic retreat has triggered an immediate shift among systemic opportunists. China's state-controlled energy entities, which previously purchased over 90% of Iran's black market crude through dark fleet tankers, suspended all maritime lifting operations in the Persian Gulf. The decision was determined by a stark calculation: the maritime insurance premiums for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz escalated by 400%, following the failure of the Iranian Coast Guard's electronic signaling systems. The discounted Persian crude is no longer economically viable when matched against the escalating physical risk of unmonitored waters. The regime's primary source of external hard currency has ceased to exist. Concurrently, the Russian Federation faces an immediate disruption to its own strategic inventory. The tactical assembly plants in central Iran, which manufactured an average of 400 Shahed series loitering munitions per month for deployment in Europe, have halted operations. The line stoppage was not caused by a military strike but by a subcomponent failure. The domestic subcontractors responsible for molding the fiberglass airframes refused to deliver the components after the central bank attempted to pay them in unbacked electronic treasury certificates. The military alliance between Moscow and Tehran has dissolved into a series of unfulfilled supply contracts inside the domestic territory. The cost of this structural paralysis is borne entirely by the urban population. The cessation of the state-subsidized food distribution network has divided the country into distinct survival zones. In the absence of a functional national currency, agricultural producers in Mazandaran and Fars provinces refuse to ship grain to the urban centers, retaining the yields to use as direct barter currency within local networks. The metropolitan areas, completely dependent on centralized logistics, are facing a systemic caloric deficit. The Ministry of Agriculture's remaining grain silos hold less than 12 days of baseline supply, and the administrative capacity to distribute it has collapsed along with the transport network. The state's countermeasures have accelerated the velocity of the fragmentation. To generate immediate liquidity, regional governors have begun independent negotiations with external entities. In Sistan and Baluchistan, local authorities have de facto legalized cross-border fuel smuggling into Pakistan, levying an autonomous 10% transit tax in Pakistani rupees to pay the salaries of provincial municipal workers. The central government's tax base has effectively shrunk to the administrative borders of Tehran province. The geographic entity known as the Islamic Republic has ceased to function as a unified economic market. Reverting instead to an archipelago of competing fiefdoms, the ultimate systemic risk has shifted from the threat of a regional war to the threat of unsecured, highly enriched materials. The nuclear facilities at Natanz and Fordow are no longer operating as state projects. They have become heavily fortified technical islands. The technical personnel and security detachments guarding the centrifuges are isolated from the national command chain, operating under autonomous emergency protocols. They possess the material to construct multiple fission devices, yet they lack the food supplies to sustain their own perimeters for another 3 weeks. The international community is no longer monitoring a cohesive state adversary. It is tracking an unstable archive of weapons-grade material, protected by an increasingly desperate, unpaid military faction The diplomatic framework negotiated over the Memorial Day weekend was designed to prevent a kinetic catastrophe by securing an Iranian capitulation. Instead, it has exposed the fundamental structural fragility of the system it attempted to defuse. The signature on the Memorandum of Understanding is worthless because the state apparatus required to enforce its terms has dissolved into competing factions, rogue assassination cells, and paralyzed infrastructure. The point of no return has not resulted in a stable American-managed peace. It has resulted in a vacuum of authority across the Middle East's most volatile geography. The surrender is complete, but there is no longer a state left to execute it.